Now, moving right along, we've got a great conversation coming. This is a fellow I've known for some time. As a matter of fact, it's interesting that he comes on very close after Susan and Dennis, in that Tim Armstrong spent a very large part of his career running all of sales for Google. And when the news came out that he was leaving a very lofty and important position at Google to run AOL, I think there are a lot of us in the industry that were scratching our heads a little bit and saying, why would you leave such a successful company for a company that seems clearly ready for a turnaround? And I think that Tim Armstrong relished that challenge, and he's coming to speak to us to have a conversation about where things are about a year into his tenure, or maybe I should say half a year. Tim? Welcome to CNC. So thank you for coming.
Thanks for having me.
It's great for you to be here, and AOL has it's gone through its own rebranding actually since we'll talk about that a little bit, because not only do you work with marketers, but you are a marketer, and you've recently done a major marketing effort. So we'll talk about that. But I wanted to start with something you've been saying in recent weeks, where you've been sort of explaining what you found when you came to AOL, and how the company was organized and incented, and you found that some of those incentives were perhaps not aligned with where you thought the company needed to be going. So can you explain what those sort of metrics of success were and why you changed them?
Sure. So first, it's nice to be in the oldest theater in New York, so thanks for having us. And I think that the company is today organized around different principles than it was a year ago to a large degree. And when I got to the company, there were kind of two main drivers of metrics. One was a focus on gross revenue, and I'll explain why I think that was an issue. And the second was a real focus around page views and engagement. And I think engagement is a very important topic, so that's not the wrong metric, but for where AOL was, it was kind of an issue. And the gross revenue focus, if you were purely gross revenue focused as a company in a business, you tend to start looking for ways to just purely grow, things that are going to grow the top line without worrying necessarily about what's happening on the bottom line. So AOL kind of had an expanded focus into marketing services areas and other things, basically looking for, gross revenue growth. One example of that is AOL got heavily into search engine marketing, which allowed the company to book gross revenue at a high level, have very small margin behind it, but looked very good from a gross revenue standpoint. From where I sat in the industry, AOL as a search engine marketer, probably not a core DNA skill set for the company. So that's one example of the gross revenue front. The page view engagement metric, which is a very important metric for all businesses on the internet, but as a sole metric, you could have a business, which was what happening at AOL, is we had page views growing like this and unique visitors going down like this, and I used to call it the alligator problem, which is eventually the jaws are going to shut. And so what we did is reorient the company around how do you get unique user growth and then pile on top of that natural kind of engagement growth. But the engagement stuff that I saw at AOL when I got there were photo galleries with 100 photos in them, those type of things, which on the surface looked like engagement and page views were going up, but it was really just forcing users to go through.
So in other words, do you think some of the creators of product, editorial, and content products at AOL were because there was such a focus on page views, they would start to create editorial products that would force people to click through a lot of things to create page views?
Yeah, I mean, if you were getting measured on those areas, I don't think it was intentional that they were saying, hey, we're going to have a user experience which is subpar and create a lot of things. But if you started to look through your metrics and say, what drives page view adoption, you'd start to see there's 5 or 6 big levers you can push to do that. But when those levers get pushed too far, it probably has a reverse effect on unique visitor growth. So.
And was it also not mapping to making money and to satisfying your marketing constituents?
Yeah, I think that's, part of the other thing we started to measure very closely last year was what is the real return you give to advertisers? AOL has actually a pretty fantastic audience. If you look at AOL's audience size versus other competitors our size, our audience typically performs better for advertisers. And I think one thing we wanted to be careful about was let's not artificially make our audience look worse because we have these experiences for marketers that were not great. So I think one of the things we started started to downshift into too was, very heavy analytics on if marketers are running with us, what's the real return they're getting, not how many impressions they get, what's the return that they get from us. So I think those are the types of things that we really started to tweak, and what you see from the last 12 months and what you see through the course of this summer from us going forward is you're going to see continued big shift and tough changes at the company to make sure we focus on healthy, unique visitors, healthy engagement, and healthy return for advertisers.
Do you think it's fair how I contextualize you coming on stage, and it's fine if you say no, that you took a turnaround job?
Yeah, I think, the case of the turnaround at AOL, and I think from the surface, there's a lot of places on the internet today, which I think some of the earlier brands were saying, oh, there's turnarounds. We have an acute issue at AOL, which is, people aren't really investing in narrow band subscriptions, anymore. So we actually, compared to most of the companies we compete against, have a separate line item of revenue, which is going down, because fundamentally people don't invest in that type of, service anymore. So, we are battling to make our internet properties and ad revenue grow on this side of it. On the other side, we have a, subscriber growth, which is going down. So, if you compare us to a Yahoo or someone like that, we actually have two sides to our business. We have the subscriber side and the kind of media side in general, and what we're doing is balancing both of those to make sure we have a strong, viable company for the future.
And so on the subscriber side, I mean, that has, in the analysis of the business that's done by analysts, and you're now a public company, they say, oh, well, AOL's major profit center is disappearing. Right, which is your subscriber base, and your job is to sort of cross this chasm of revenue to the folks in the room. How do you look at that in terms of the products that you make on the media side and setting expectations both in the industry, which can be a pretty cruel place when it comes to coverage, as well as that hits perceptions of marketers, right? Who think, oh, well, AOL is never going to cross that chasm and replace this wonderful, profitable narrowband subscriber revenue with media revenue.
Yeah, so I think a true statement historically has been that the access business has driven the vast majority of profitability for the company in the last 3 or 4 years probably, and before that as well. There is an interesting area for us to cross the chasm in, which is the profitability of the ad and media business can offer very high margins and very good return on capital spend. So I think what we're excited about right now is Artie Mintz and I, who's our CFO, have basically separated the business to say, historically AOL spent billions of dollars on acquisitions and used that subscriber money for a lot of different, things. We basically said, look, take the subscriber money off the table for a minute. It's kind of been piling up on our balance sheet right now. How do you run this? If you were a stringent startup right now, and this was the only business we were in, was the publishing business with advertising attached to it, how would this company run? What metrics would you look at? What things would you invest in? How would you use the money? Those things. So I think, we see and are excited about the opportunity for AOL to, build up cash from the subscriber business on our balance sheet, but don't run the company that way. And I think that was the decision we made, 13 months ago. And I think that is a decision which helped us, on a clarity standpoint, use our resources, correctly. I think we spun out of Time Warner with, basically no debt, a credit agreement, and some other things. And if you look at what we've been able to build up on our balance sheet, we've managed our capital very closely. We restructured the company, which was unfortunate. I think doing a layoff is, not a choice that anyone would want to make, but that was a choice we had to make if we were going to really run as a profitable web entity. And then 3 is, I think we've actually seen, pretty incredible traction from the business side now in terms of what we're doing with content and what we're doing with advertisers. And I think that, it's hard to see because we're a public company and people saw our Q1 earnings and they said, oh my God, something's happened, at AOL. But in reality, what we did was made a very conscious choice to say, let's set this business up for future growth. This is you have to be willing to take all the blog arrows and the press arrows, of what we're doing. I mean, it's reality. And by the way, if we weren't getting arrows, we wouldn't be doing our job.
Right. To give us some numbers. I like numbers. So tell us how large this media audience is. And if you can, distinguish between those that come because of the media properties and those that come because when they dial up, they get the AOL homepage.
So broad context, and I'm going to break these numbers down for you a little bit because I think it'll be helpful. We get about 250 million global visitors to AOL properties. We get about 100 million in the U.S. And then when you start breaking those numbers down, those are the unduplicated numbers, you start to see that the media business basically ranges from 60 to 80 million, and we're making changes to that business, right now, and we'll continue to make changes throughout the course of this year, so those numbers will fluctuate up and down. The second thing we have is the communications products and suites, so email, messaging, those things. There's tens of millions of people on those products and services. And we're very focused on improving those. You'll see some new products and services out of our groups later this year. And then when you break down basically the other types of services, other things like Winamp and Shoutcast and other types of applications that we have, there's millions of people on those products. So if you take just take the US number, the 100 million, and you break it apart and to look at all the subcategories, you look at something like a MapQuest has got 40 million users, AOL News, 24 million users. So you have some very, very large individual properties. When you unduplicate them together, it looks like 100 million. And our goal for that is, we'd love to see that 100 million number grow. My guess is this year you're going to see it go up and down, and probably into the beginning of next year. But underneath it, what we're trying to build is very healthy properties, which will, result in, we see great opportunities to grow unique visitors.
Now, talk to me about what the brand means to those visitors, right? So you went through a rebranding sort of exercise, and you modernized, and you have sort of cool stuff behind the brand, like goldfish, and I don't know what that pink thing is that's behind there. It looks like a sponge or a jellyfish.
Jellyfish, I don't know.
It's something. It looks cool. But when I'm at MapQuest, I don't necessarily know I'm at AOL, right? And so how do you think about that? Is the AOL brand a brand that you want those 100 million and growing people to think that's what they're at, like Yahoo, right, which has been Yahoo's traditional strategy? Or is it that you're sort of federating a lot of different properties and you're not as concerned whether or not someone thinks they're engaging with AOL?
Right. We would like both to happen. So we have a brand architecture which we're continuing to work on, which in essence looks a lot more like Disney's brand architecture, which is we have a main property, which is AOL or Disney. Then we have sub-federated media brands like ESPN, Disney owns ABC, ESPN, Miramax, those type of things. So we basically have a federated group of sites. And what we're doing right now, and we'll be coming out with more this summer, is kind of building super networks around those sites. So you will see us in the next 6 months basically have a incremental pushes around the AOL brand. You'll also see us start to highlight and come together around very large satellite networks underneath those other brands. And I think we will also be putting the AOL brand on more of those other properties, but not as a AOL Engadget, but as an Engadget with a higher level of AOL visibility there. More in essence for the business community than for necessarily consumers. But I think people are always surprised by the assets we own.
Right, yeah, I think that's true. You mentioned, however, that there were a number of things that AOL owns that perhaps were not core to the new strategy.
Right.
As a matter of fact, I think you said recently that you have to cut back before you can grow.
Yeah.
So talk to me about those properties. You recently sold ICQ to Digital Sky Technologies. And Bebo is on the block.
Right.
And Bebo strikes me as perhaps one of those page view acquisitions.
It could have. I mean, I wasn't there for the Bebo acquisition, but if you look at the core tenant that Bebo brought to the table, I mean, they had, 10, I forget the exact number when they bought it, 10 million uniques, which is a fairly sizable number of uniques, but what they really brought was massive engagement and page views. So it kind of fit that metric very cleanly.
Right. But what was it about Bebo that made you decide that it was not core?
I mean, I think a few things. I think one is, the monetization capabilities of Bebo seem to be pretty low. In general, they hadn't figured out a monetization program. Two, there was Facebook, I think, had done a pretty serious job of hurting the social networking space because they've done a great job with their product and service. And three is, from a danger standpoint, Bebo was a big acquisition, $850 million, and to make it work, there were some unnatural things the company were doing to kind of try to pump traffic to it. So one of the things, the second week I was there, I noticed I had logged into AIM, and we had a program where we were taking AIM profiles and shifting them to Bebo profiles, kind of automatically for users. And I went in to do an AIM profile, and when it shifted to Bebo, it lost all my information. And so when I started to peel back what the integration between Bebo and AIM was, we were losing a serious amount of AIM users who were getting pushed into Bebo but losing their information.
And
so
they weren't liking that.
They weren't liking that. So
Yeah.
I think there was a little bit of a timeout period where we said, hold on, timeout. What is the
Right.
Bebo asset? What is the core value proposition it brings? Forget about driving traffic and hooking into everything AOL does, because it doesn't seem like it's successful. And after we went through that process, we said, look, Bebo should be core engineered for what it's good at. So we basically culled it down to just engineering. And two is we basically spent the last year really trying to make it work. And when we got to the end of it, we said, look, this asset is either going to be better with somebody else or better if we take it out of our portfolio altogether. So
Now,
that's the
if
process.
no one buys it, do you just turn it off?
Yeah, I mean, we're not through the process yet, and I don't know what's going to happen. So there is interest in the asset. If there ends up being no interest in the asset, we haven't planned that yet, but potentially we could shut it down.
Now let's talk about kind of if you were to describe what AOL's strategy is going forward.
Sure.
From my point of view, what I've heard is you could just say content.
Right.
Unpack that a bit.
Yeah,
What
sure.
do you mean by that?
So there's three main things underneath our content strategy. One is a real focus on bringing technology to journalists. So again, this is an example that I've used a lot, but in my days at Google, I probably got to meet every major media company. I met a lot of very well-known journalists in the world. And one thing I would always notice going to these meetings is journalists were the only people in the room who never had any information other than what they knew themselves. And so that was something.
I have a feeling you just made a tweet.
Right. Well, I'm sorry, they had a lot of information, but they had no data behind, and they were competing against, if you look at what's happening on the internet today, you can pretty much go to any other professional, position at any company in almost any industry, and there is some piece of a desktop or data system which helps people scale, what they do. And I saw it, distinctly at AOL when I came in also is, we have some of the world's best journalists at AOL. And those journalists, if you're writing about healthcare or religion or those things, AOL could provide a lot of data to those journalists and a desktop to those journalists so that they can actually scale, what they're doing. And I think that's number one on the strategies to really, how does technology help the future of journalism, period? And how do consumers get better information? The second piece is really around what are we targeting? What are the areas that AOL is going after to provide better information for consumers? One is local. We have a big investment in Patch, which we're basically putting communities online and journalism in communities. The second area is how do you take big national global scope content areas and really make them much, much more in depth with more structured data, more information, more demand algorithms, those things, but also more journalists. I mean, one of the things we've invested in a lot over the last year is more journalists around these areas.
How many part and full-time journalists do you
Yes,
employ?
we have about 500 or so full-time, I'm not counting Patch, because Patch has another set of journalists, 500 full-time journalists and about another 3,500 sort of part-time journalists that are, most of them, not most of them, a lot of them are well-known, highly trained, journalists.
So now, how does associated content fit in?
With AOL or
Well,
Yahoo? Or?
I asked that question because I want to kind of toss it in there because you're doing seed. Yahoo bought associated content. We've got demand coming later. So were you bidding for that and did you wish you had that asset, or is it that associated content and what Yahoo's going to do with it is distinct from seed, or is it pretty much the same and you both have similar strategies? Like, give me a sense of
what's happening.
Yeah.
So I am not 1,000% familiar with what Yahoo or Demand.
Was it an asset that you were looking?
Associated Content was a business that started in my basement with Luke Beatty, who was my college roommate, and I know all the board members, I know all the management team, I know the engineers.
Well, that's why I was a bit, I think a lot of folks just figured it was just gonna.
I think one is, there's a few things behind this. One is, I think Associated Content is a great company. I think they have done a good job building what they're doing. I think they've been on the radar, for a long time. I think when you take a step back and say, what assets does AOL have? What things are we betting on? I think you'll see a couple slight differences. I think one is, We are attacking local, for instance, with real journalists, real communities, in those communities, which is much different than I think what anyone of our competitors are doing. There are people using the seed type platforms for that, which I think may be successful, but we're doing it differently. I think too is when you look at the national, global assets we have, we are the only company who's got an ad server. We're probably the second largest ad server outside of DoubleClick.
Right.
We have a significant ad network and ad.com. We have significant, content properties, which, most other people basically either farm their content or they do syndicated deals for content. So when you think about what our strategy is for seed, I'm not going to go into a ton of detail about this because this is strategic for us. If you think about the ad serving, the ad network, you think about our content properties, you think about the 4,000 journalists, and then you think about what we can build out with a seed type platform or Studio Now, which is a very significant video platform on the web. We will create probably deeper, richer content experiences than anybody else online. That's not to say that competitors won't do that, because I think there's a lot of room in the content space. But if you mix our brands, the advertising heft we have, and the journalist heft with the platform heft we're building right now, and you think about how you could mix those into a cocktail, which could be very attractive, I think we have a differentiated strategy, which is deep, rich, engaging. It's not to say competitors can't do that, but I think we have a unique set of assets when you look at the things that we're building.
That's what I'm trying to tease out a bit. I think you're getting there, but you don't want to go all the way because it's strategic to you. But in terms of, we've got Joanne's going to be here from Demand shortly, and you use the word demand algorithms with a little d,
right,
as opposed to a big D. But there is definitely a lot of movement in this space right now of quality content that at scale for very specific purposes, right? And so AOL is definitely playing there, right? But your differentiation, if I can play it back to you and you can tell me if I've got this or not, is that it's going to be driven by specific community. Right. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, it's going to basically, let me give you a more concrete example because that maybe is more helpful, is, let's take every Senate race in the United States, right? So if you're going to go vote for your local senator, chances are you don't know everything he's voted for, how many times he's shown up for things, who's given him money, how does he actually stand on the top 15 issues that matter to you in general. And typically, because in the world today, journalists have to focus on one senator at a time and cover what's hot and then move to the next thing. The reality is, with the content systems and technology, as well as seed platforms, as well as the high-tiered journalist, you can imagine how you would take something like a Senate race and make it look much different than what gets covered today. And I'll give you another example for the healthcare debates. What we said for our healthcare coverage was basically everybody was covering the healthcare debates up at a very top level. And what we said is, look, with the power of our journalists, the power of seed, the power of the different things we can cover, why don't we splinter the healthcare debate? Let's actually take the healthcare document, splinter it up, and basically measure it per state. What does it mean per state? For the healthcare, what's going to help with the healthcare coverage that happened, this past winter. And what you found was, for every single state, the healthcare, debate and coverage and program was very different. The general media isn't able to cover it at a state-by-state level down to the level of detail that matters for you or me, for the states that we live in. So if you use technology and you use these scaled abilities to take journalists and give them more data and information, what you would have found in the healthcare debate was there's really 4 states that mattered, in the healthcare debate. And actually digging into those 4 states very significantly, you would have found a lot of things. And then you could have found other things that other states traded off in that process.
So much of what you're doing is sort of re-engineering journalism, both service and repertorial journalism, using technology, using regional community, and using interest community. Is that fair?
Yeah, and really the depth of, there's 2 things that have fundamentally changed around the content space. One is distribution, right? So you look at distribution on the internet 15 years ago or 10 years ago, and you look at distribution on offline media properties 15 years ago, basically what you had was major networks, pumping out the ability to send lots of traffic around different places. Today, the distribution, it's almost like we've rewired the cable system for you and I, Twitter, Facebook, these type of things. Distribution has exploded, and the depth of information, I can understand what John Battelle wants, where you live, those type of things. By the way, ads are targeted that way, right? The ad systems have been built for the last 10 years to keep up with distribution. Content systems haven't been, and I think that's
right, and that's a very big shift, is
Yep.
to take content and start to treat it as specific to who is consuming it,
Right.
as opposed to
huge shift.
sort of the journalistic presumption, which is we know as journalists. And
Yep.
I'm using we because as a journalist,
Yep.
and we're going to tell you,
Yep.
right? And so that is a big cultural shift as well for journalism.
Yep.
I think if you had said 5 or 10 years ago that AOL would mean, a new approach to journalism,
Right.
that might have been an odd concept.
Right.
5 or 10 years ago. So it's an interesting shift for the brand. We have time for questions. I'd love for you guys to ask Tim anything. So the mic runners are going to be in their normal places, and up there in the gallery balcony there are mics, which I cannot see because of the lights, but they're up there as well.
There's a lot of laptops up there, though.
There are a lot of that. That's because that's where the power is.
Is that where
There's
the power
cords
is up there?
Right. We just had Susan here and
Yep.
Dennis. Do you miss Google?
I miss the people at Google. I think that I saw Susan last week out at the DA conference, and so I have made a lot of great friends there. I was there for almost a decade. I will tell you this, my passion, when I got out of college is I started a newspaper, we ended up buying another one. Then I ended up going out to Seattle to work at one of the first content companies online, which was Starwave, Paul Allen's company. So for me, I loved Google. I loved being there. It was a fantastic experience. My passion for the last 20 years has really been around this media in general, and at Google I spent a lot of time on it as well. So I'm really happy to be where I am, and I miss the people. And Google's doing great. I mean, they're continuing to do a lot of.
It must be pretty different, though, to be a CEO and a public company CEO than to run a sales organization, no matter how large it was that you ran.
Yep. Yeah, it's different. I think one thing I spent a lot of time on, right when I did the announcement, and at Google I got to spend a lot of time with CEOs and boards and those things. So one of the things I did is a tour where I went to talk to a lot of CEOs, global CEOs, when I took the job, and I've had a great opportunity to be mentored by really fantastic people. And look, I think I think we're doing a good job. I think. If you look at our performance in the last year about what we've restructured the company, spun it out of Time Warner, done those things, I mean, I probably wouldn't wish that upon any first-year CEO, but I think we accomplished, a lot of stuff.
Well, it was it was sort of poignant to see Steve Case at the D conference last week and hear him tell the stories of acquiring Time Warner.
That's pretty amazing. Yeah.
And then the culture fit, well, that's the wrong phrase. the mismatch between AOL and Time Warner is sort of legendary now.
Yep.
When you were interviewing for the job, was it a prerequisite of yours that we're going to spin this thing out?
It was a possibility. It wasn't guaranteed, and I was more intrigued by the opportunity. I think fundamentally the content space will be the next epicenter of the internet, and AOL's a global brand, had global content properties. So even if it was inside of Time Warner, I think I would have taken the job, and that was the case actually when I went there. And then, importantly, one of the things I did is I talked to Steve before I started, actually. I had a couple of conversations with him. I talked to Jeff Bewkes a lot before I started. I talked to a bunch of AOL partners, some of the board members from Time Warner. And, the one thing I found was a pretty wholeheartedness that there was a big opportunity, and if somebody wanted to really grab the tiger by the tail, it's not going to be easy, but there's probably an opportunity to make something significant happen. So that's just kind of what we're doing.
Right. We've got a question here.
Hi, Smokey Fontaine, Interactive One. My question, I love what you said about content. The future of AOL is being content in many ways, especially these richer, kind of broader experiences. How do you reconcile the idea of cost within that? I mean, one of the big values of the demand media kind of role is that it's so much cheaper, right? And so the margins on an aggregated news business are always going to be far greater than the margins on an original news business like the New York Times versus AOL News in a way. But how does cost play a part of that, and are you, willing to move in that direction and spend that money?
Yeah, so we've already moved in that direction. I think we've gone from about 20% of the content being done ourselves to about 80% of it done ourselves today. So I think we still do aggregated content, but much less than we did before. And I think we're making a bet on a few things. I think, one is, I see this all the time because so many people cover AOL. Somebody will write a story, and it's not always accurate, and then that story turns into 50 other stories, and people are just scraping. And I think over time, this may not happen in the next year or two, but I think long time it will, is original journalism that's truthful and has real impact on what's being covered will eventually be tagged. That's one of the things that we've thought about as well, is how do you tag that type of journalism. And I think, and then the second thing is, what business are you in and who you're trying to serve? So there are cases where we are doing content that's very profitable, and there's cases we're doing content that's probably less profitable, but the reality is, what community are you serving? What are you giving to the end user? And I think, if you purely look at your business as, every single piece of content, which is what we measure as well, by the way, even if it's not as profitable, we still measure it, in general, is what is the end goal you're trying to get to? And my guess is, if you only sat around and did profitable content, my guess is, that it will get you to some level of business and probably of successful business. But if you want to serve the world's, community and have a very robust brand and business and those type of things, I think we're kind of, realizing the fact that we are going to do a spectrum of profitable things in general. And by the way, there may be things like the healthcare debate, which may not be profitable, but may be so impactful for us, our brand, the way we did it, the way we covered. Like our head journalist on the healthcare debate just won, Journalist of the Year from the Online Digital, Journalism Association. And I think, that lends a lot of credibility to our business that may not be P&L based. It may be the fact that, look, it attracts 50 other great journalists to come work with us, that people know we're putting in that type of commitment, and so I think we're measuring the profitability of every single thing we're doing very closely, but I think we are making choices based on what we think the long-term brand implications are and the long-term ability for us to strategically grow our business, into the places we need to grow to. So,
great. I wish we could take more, and I don't. If there's a short one, is there a short one? Okay, we'll take one more short question. It must be 140 characters or less.
The Twitter question.
I'm just wondering if there are also areas where you're making choices of where to fight for dominance in content and where not to fight on properties, specific properties.
Yes, we are. So AOL has over 200 consumer-facing properties right now. My guess is we won't fight in all of those spaces in general. And one of the other things that I think we're noticing is the ability to have more kind of super networks in general, where we have a lot of offerings that hit that we do believe fragmentation is a good thing for the internet and a good thing for our content properties. But one thing we'd love to have is more universal brands around some of the larger categories. So I think you will basically see us get laser focused on those kind of super network areas in general, and we'll trade in and out of content properties. We do have a specific list of areas that we're going to fight hard in, content areas, but I think you should come work at AOL and I'll tell you.
All right. You're hiring is what you're saying.
We're hiring.
Excellent. All right. Well, please join me in thanking Tim for coming today.
Thank you very much.
That was great. Thank you.